Hello there, everybody. We are kicking off once again with our NaMo Home Evening, our monthly Google Hangouts, where I try and assemble a guest or technical difficulties. Of course, my mistake. Now, once again, sorry to start the spiel. So every month I try and assemble a guest or a panel of guests to talk about something interesting, possibly inside, possibly outside of Mormonism, and explore other topics if we have the ability to do so. So today we have Objectively Dan, Bryan, and Colleen joining us. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hello.
Awesome.
Hello.
So we have, I want to just give everybody a chance to introduce themselves, of course. And the way that I'd like to do that, because it's going to be kind of the central focus of what we're discussing today, I hope that all of us can give, like a Reader's Digest version of, if we grew up in a faith tradition and what our faith transition has been since leaving that transition. We have Objectively Dan, who runs a Street Epistemology show, Truth Wanted, with the atheist community of Austin. We have Colleen Deitz, who runs the Mormon Happy Hour podcast and Angels on Fire blog. And then we have Bryan Stiles, who I am just told is a networking guru, not the physical, but like the rubbing elbows type of guru. So needless to say, we have a lot of fun to talk about today. Why don't we go ahead and get started with Bryan? Bryan, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah,
All
Bryan,
right.
tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about that networking guru. I like that.
Yeah, I slide into other people's channels and then introduce people who I slide into their channels to other channels that I slide into. So, but yeah, I grew up in Mormonism. One of those not super large families for Mormons, but 6 kids. I have 5 brothers. Born and raised, and I'm actually number 5 to leave the church. And so, yeah, 4 of my siblings left, mostly around like 2013, 14. One maybe a little later. And I, maybe embarrassing to say, but I held out for longer. And but kind of like most people's story, it's not anything too grand. It took a while for me to kind of make that mental switch to be open to considering, oh, hey, maybe the church isn't true. And once that happened, it was just a matter of research. And so CES letter to my wife, all the above, threw me into a deep dive into obsessive studying that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. I am actually still in a mixed faith marriage, so that's why the Street Epistemology has become of interest to me, because I found it a useful tool to communicate with my wife, family members, and what have you. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest version for me. I don't know if you wanted us to cover any other particulars. If not, we can move right on to the next.
No, that was actually perfect, because what we're going to eventually get into talking about is how these faith transitions kind of catalyzed. And it sounds like it was just the torrential avalanche of Mormon history that kind of dragged you kicking and screaming away from all of this. And I'd love to explore that a little bit moving forward as well.
I would say the catalyst was kind of social issues, but that just kind of put me in the right frame of mind to allow myself to touch anti-Mormon, scary word stuff. So yeah, and that was a deep dive into history, and it didn't take long from there, because once you dive into the rabbit hole and you're voraciously consuming, it doesn't take long. So
fantastic. Thank you for that. Colleen, you mind telling us a little bit about yourself for anyone who has not listened to Mormon Happy Hour, or who didn't catch 3 months ago, I guess it was, when we had you on here?
Sure. So I host the Mormon Happy Hour podcast. I've been doing it for almost a year now. And did you want me to do my faith crisis now as well, or transition, or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, absolutely. Reader's Digest, Colleen in a nutshell.
So, I had a shelf item or two when I was a teenager. One, I was very closely connected with the LGBTQ community before it existed back when I was in high school. And then I went to Brigham Young University, of course, because I was born and raised Mormon. And I was told that if I were pregnant following, be expelled. So that was another shelf item for me before I even knew what shelves were, obviously. And then fast forward to I married a sexual predator who went to jail a couple times while I was married to him. And then that was pretty much my catalyst, was discovering some pictures. I filed for divorce. Our current bishop told me, or called him to serve in the young men's within a week of both of us confessing his underage indiscretions. So that was like a major, like, I just left the community. I didn't stop believing, just left the community because I no longer felt safe. Ended up moving, was in a relationship with someone else, ended up getting married. Wasn't until I went public with my BYU rape story and was socially or culturally expelled and excommunicated from that I really began to think about whether this was really a community I wanted to be a part of. So my exit was more a consequence of social and cultural issues. And then once I began really studying the culture around how sexual assault is handled within the Mormon Church, that's when I started listening to Year of Polygamy podcasts and things like that, and realized that the church currently, as it stands, is merely an echo of a church that was founded by a sexual predator back in the day. And I was like, okay, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. So that's my nutshell.
So, Colleen, people come out of the church or come out of faith traditions in many different ways. And there are many, catalyzing events that cause people from all different faith traditions to leave. Oftentimes, so I had more of an apathetic transition where I didn't really care to go to church anymore and just kind of stopped going. But eventually, after I started studying church history, that's when I feel like I really made the mental transition out, because I had made the emotional transition out long before then. And now, because I have, become opposed to the church based on intellectual and social issues, I'm not one of the people who has had a bad experience in the church. I only really ever had good or extremely boring experiences in church. But I become infuriated when people say, well, you left because you had a bad experience, because they don't know me. They don't know what I've experienced. They haven't walked in my shoes. But what you are saying, it sounds like you might fall under the umbrella of somebody who had a bad time in church or had a bad experience, and that, caused you to leave the church. What do you do when somebody may say that you left because you had a bad experience?
I don't know. Like, people will often say, like, oh, well, the church is true, but the people aren't, and like shit like that. And I hate when they say that to me. And so that's basically that I get. And I don't know. I guess I don't really care anymore when they say that, because I just explained to them, I'm like, well, I didn't feel safe, and I'm not going to be a part of a community that I don't feel safe in, and that's that. I'm protecting myself and my family, and I don't even get into doctrine, because doctrine isn't why I left. And so, like, if they want to have a doctrinal discussion with me, I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested. Like, that doesn't, like, it's, so basically it's just me. That's the pushback I get, is that, well, the church is true, but people aren't. I'm really sorry that bad things happen to you. But the one golden, or the one silver lining to all that is, who obviously my parents have taken it really hard, because they're still true believing Mormons. They took me leaving the church pretty hard. But, you know, they know what I've experienced in my life very intimately, obviously, because they're my parents. And I think that they are at a place where they completely understand why I have left. And although it may cause them heartache, they don't push me back in at all because they understand. And so that's kind of nice, actually. So I don't get a whole lot of pushback.
Wow. Very interesting. Okay. I have a feeling like we'll be touching on that a little bit as well as we continue further into our discussion. So let's go ahead and shift over to Dan. Dan, you didn't come out of Mormonism, but you did come out of a faith tradition. Tell us how that all happened, and now you host a weekly show about street epistemology. Well, what happened in the past few years?
So I'm the odd one out. Did not grow up in Mormonism, but I
burn the heretic. Not welcome here.
I did grow up in a religious community. I'll cheat here and say, if you want to know my whole story, my favorite interview I've done is for Voices of Deconversion, and they have a podcast where I can talk with them, and that kind of gives you a whole thing. But long story short, I grew up in the Methodist Church, and also in a kind of a Baptist area as well. I kind of switched between the two churches growing up, and I was a part of a college ministry. And to make a super long story short, I had a conversation with a guy named Anthony Magdamasco about 3 years ago, while I was still a Christian, and you can actually find that on his YouTube channel still, which is really cool. It wasn't the only thing that kind of, made me walk away, but it was one of the things. I mean, it was a year and a half long deconversion for me of really thinking about things and researching things, and I kept it really private. I was, again, working in the college ministry at the time. I did summer camp stuff as well, so there was a lot of things to it. But I felt like a couple things. I mean, one, the history didn't make sense, right? I couldn't make a historical case for Christianity being, quote unquote true, whatever that means, right? But also, I felt like I was failing in the church to be the best person I could be, in the sense that the church's response to the LGBT community has been really terrible. The way that the church has responded to lots of different social issues in general just hasn't been with the right state of mind. It's always been out of fear or out of ignorance in a lot of cases around here. And it was just hard for me to support something like that. Especially, me being younger, I see a lot of people my age that were leaving and stuff, and, that has its toll as well. But really, I was super invested, and it was really hard for me to do that. So eventually I got involved with the ACA, and now I have a show where you can call in every Friday and talk to me and other people about different beliefs and stuff. And that's really fun. But yeah, that's kind of the short end of it. It's been an interesting ride, to say the least.
That's a perfect way to transition into our subject matter for today, because we are going to be discussing street epistemology. Mm-hmm. And one of the what can I say, the forefathers of this is a guy named Anthony Magnabosco, and you sent me your video of the interview that he snagged you and your friend on a college campus. Mm-hmm. You guys are a member of this Cru ministry, youth ministry group, and the three of you had a very interesting conversation, and it went longer than a number of the street epistemology videos go. Mm-hmm. And it was also very interesting to see your interview with him. What was a year later, when you sent him an email and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you."
Yeah, about a year and a half later. Yeah, almost 2 years at that point, I think. But yeah, that was the blunt of my deconversion was in between those 2 years. I had actually a lot of people don't know this, but I kind of already started the process a little bit before I talked to Anthony. But Anthony really opened a lot of doors for me, as far as where my mind was heading and what kinds of things I was thinking about. But you wouldn't know that from the video. I sounded very confident. But
So let's go ahead and just open it up to the panel then, because we're going to talk street epistemology.
Mhm.
Just what the hell is this? What is this, the great atheist silver bullet that we've always been looking for that eviscerates every Christian argument ever? I mean, what is this? And I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to take it.
Well, I feel like I have to pick it up because I've a lot of what I do revolves around it. So, I mean, street epistemology is just a method of talking to people about their beliefs. And it's interesting that you frame it in the language of atheists using it to like kind of tone down arguments. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I don't characterize it that way. And there's a lot of people that don't. There's some people that do for sure, but I see it more as a broad way of communicating with people about beliefs and getting to the heart of why people believe what they believe. And in fact, I think you might see it as a type of argumentative process, but instead of you giving counterpoints or other evidences to demonstrate why somebody else doesn't believe what they believe or why you disagree, instead you're more asking questions about why they believe and asking them sincerely and honestly. And it's something that can be applied with all kinds of beliefs, not just religious beliefs. Even if you're an atheist and you say something like, there's no gods, like that's a claim that you can kind of dismantle through street epistemology. So it's a really powerful tool, and it's been growing a couple of years, especially this past year, at least since I've been involved more and more. And I've seen a lot more people pick it up and try to use it. And I think it's great. Like I said, for anybody, I've given some talks on it before. I would be more than happy to go to a church or go to a religious institution and talk about the method, because I believe really anybody can use it. I'm not biased, I try not to be. We're all biased, but
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of look at it similar to Dan, how it's a tool that you can put in your tool set as a method of communicating with people. And just kind of looking and watching other people like Anthony Magnabosco's channel, it gives you a lot of ideas of how to model a conversation that will go well. I think one of the big things we don't have these days, everyone talks about how everything's so combative on social media. There aren't that many examples of people having just good conversations with each other. And I think just watching street epistemology and kind of learning Socratic questioning, and it's a really easy way to pick up good behavior for how to model conversations. So
I agree. I think that's the thing that drew me to street epistemology right away, was that it takes a lot of the confrontation out of the conversation. And I really enjoyed the approach that Dan kind of takes to the whole to the technique, because different street epistemologists will have different techniques. And I really enjoyed the approach that Dan took to it, because it really does reduce the friction and the confrontation. I feel like in a conversation, once you practice it and learn how to do it well, then basically you are just asking questions, and then the person that you're talking to is just thinking, and there's not that oh, you're wrong because this and I believe that. There's none of that presented in street epistemology. It's just well, why, let's get to the root of that belief, and maybe what if this and what if that, and I really think that it helps to minimize a lot. Once you become comfortable with the street epistemology, I feel like it calms you down as a person. I feel like once I can get good at it, I will then be comfortable. Whereas I'm not comfortable right now. I could become comfortable approaching my family members who are still believing members of the church and have a productive conversation, where that doesn't exist right now. I really feel like it's a good tool for any conversations. I really appreciate what it is.
Yeah, we should. You should mention, Colleen, that we got to do a little bit of it on your podcast as well. That was really fun. I got to talk to Colleen a little bit about her beliefs and stuff, and you should definitely check that out if you haven't already. I think I really enjoyed that conversation. It was very different from what I was used to. So,
For sure.
So
It was fun.
then how do these conversations start then, right? Because I mean, especially when we get to talking to family members, loved ones, coworkers, it's so often a combative subject, especially when you're talking about somebody's deeply held religious beliefs. So how do we get the ball rolling in order to start a conversation into a Socratic method type of conversation?
So a lot of people that do SE will actually go out on the street and talk to people, which is really cool, but it's definitely not something you have to do. In fact, I often advocate it as kind of a self-defense thing. And what I mean by self-defense is not necessarily you're fighting back. What I mean is a separation of kind of the ego, right? Our own kind of visceral responses that we might have. And instead kind of sticking to a method so that you can kind of so that you can avoid responding in negative ways or ways that you don't necessarily intend, because oftentimes, like you said, yeah, these kinds of conversations can very, very easily get heated if you're not treating them with the care that they need. So really, one of the ways that I have these conversations is I don't even instigate it. I just let people bring it up. If they just bring a belief out there, then I might want to, dig a little bit deeper on that. But the goal may not necessarily be to individually seek out all the beliefs you can find and just totally dismantle them, because it may also be true that you have a belief that you want to keep that might still be good and you might find to be valid, but you may not know that it's a good belief unless you kind of investigate using the method. So really, I say, if you want to, go ahead and start asking questions about what other people believe and go for it. But really, it's like I said, it's kind of it's a thing you can use for all kinds of situations. It's not just for specific conversations. It's all kinds of conversations that come up in your daily life.
One thing that I have found kind of interesting, and Bryan and I have actually been practicing back and forth a lot. I'll bring some weird hippy dippy belief that I want to keep because I think it's fun and interesting and makes my life kind of mystical. And I'll be what about essential oils and just some bullshit that I know that there's a lot of controversy about it. And so he'll practice street epistemology on me with essential oils and well, why do you believe that? Or do you believe this? Or do you think that it would work in place of this? And so he'll kind of explore different beliefs with me. And then I think one time I was reflecting on a conversation that Bryan and I had in at dinner time, and I'm like, man, street epistemology kind of takes all the mysticism out of my life and it makes it less exciting, because sometimes I'm I just want to believe, god damn it, I just want to. And so, but it's fun to kind of dig down and explore your beliefs, and I like what Dan was saying, sometimes you just want to there are good beliefs that you have. And so it's kind of fun to kind of play around with street epistemology and not see it as everything that he's questioning I have to reject. It teaches me to say, no, you need to learn what you're confident in and what you're not confident in. And so that's what I kind of appreciate about the street epistemology, is it makes me question, but it also, I have to remember to empower myself that I still have the ability to believe in things that I want to believe in. Not essential oils, but whatever.
So going into kind of a more or a practical example, I live in Texas, and you can imagine what the political landscape is here in Texas. It's probably similar to what it is in Utah and other places where a lot of people may live. And I was doing some work on a house, and so there were a number of people there, and someone made a comment about, oh, San Francisco is just, that might as well just fall into the ocean, that liberal, I don't know, negative term about San Francisco here. And my initial reaction when people say things is to just shoot out some snarky quip. But lately I've been trying, okay, well, let's kind of push that instinct back. And so I asked them, "Oh, hey, so why do you think that?" That's usually the start. Well, if they've already said what their claim is or what they believe, the next question is usually why. And he's like, "Oh yeah, well, I don't think that liberal or socialist policies are good in general for our economy." And so that right there just set the tone for starting a good conversation. And I didn't necessarily model like pure street epistemology the best in this conversation, but just having that situation where I say, "Oh, okay, why do you think that?" "Okay, well, I think this and this and this." "Okay, well," and this is where you can get into, well, if you think that all socialist policies are bad, do you think we should get rid of all, everything like roads and that kind of thing? I mean, usually it's trying to find common ground at that point, or asking, kind of digging, okay, how did you form that belief? And that's where I think street epistemology is really good, because it's like, okay, here's what they believe, and you can ask them why, and then how they decided that was true. And one of the easiest ways is you say, okay, well, if this method you used to decide that it was true, let's say we took that away, or the results came to a different conclusion, would that change your belief? And one of the things I found really nice about street epistemology is if you use it right, you can be really efficient about pushing past the reasons they give for their beliefs that don't actually inform their beliefs, if that makes any sense. Because sometimes they're like, "Oh yeah, I believe that capitalism is, or socialism is bad because everybody loses, or no one gets rich in the end." It's like, well, if everyone did get rich, would you still think socialism is bad? And they may say, no, if it worked out, then yeah, I would change my mind. But sometimes they'll say, no, that wouldn't change my confidence in belief X at all. And then okay, well, let's move on to something different. So I know I'm kind of getting into the weeds here now, but I just wanted to bring that into, how do you start a conversation like that? And oftentimes it's just, well, why do you think that? You just ask why, and try your best to be as respectful as possible. And it can take some practice.
So I guess what it sounds like it does is, with issues that seem to be very combative, deeply held personal beliefs, it sounds like it introduces a middleman into the conversation of, like, I may be coming from one side, you may be coming from a different side, or from the complete opposite side, but let's meet somewhere in the middle and talk about why we land on the sides that we land on. And that's the entire practice of analytical epistemology, understanding why we believe what we believe. And I'm going to bring in Walker's question here in the chat, because I think it's kind of important as well. And it doesn't require epistemology in the sense of having a conversation with a stranger or a coworker, so much as it does asking ourselves and our own critical epistemology of our own beliefs. Walker says, how do we use the SE method to question our science biases, quantum theory, etc.? And I think that's an important question, because there are a lot of scientific theories and a lot of scientific pop words that we like to use that are just popular, and we can throw them out there, and it seems to be the great non-believer argument. But sometimes we never question those once we come out of religion and then go to agnosticism or atheism, and we just kind of say, okay, so evolution is that's the best theory that explains everything. How do we commit critical epistemology on ourselves to question our own biases?
It's an excellent question. So really, when we're talking about, and I want to, before I answer the question, I want to point out something that you said that was interesting. You said that the conversation is kind of like you bringing your beliefs to the table and the other person bringing their beliefs to the table and kind of figuring things out. And I think that's one way you can definitely have these conversations. And I've done it before, and other people have done it before. But one advantage to using this method, I think that should be highlighted, is you can actually have a whole conversation with somebody and not talk about your own beliefs at all. So if you're afraid of like revealing what you actually believe about something, or you think that maybe what you believe might distract from the other person and they might want to attack that, you can actually, using this method, not even bring up your own beliefs when you talk about this, which I think is really cool. But when we're talking about our own beliefs, I think we have to start with, okay, first we have to define what the belief is and make sure that we're using the right, terms to describe it and stuff, and what we mean when we say. So if we're talking about quantum mechanics, I mean, that's really complicated, right? Maybe we think a certain interpretation of quantum mechanics, accurately describes reality. Okay. You got to determine reality, like what that word means, and, all kinds of definitions and stuff that have to be squared away first. And I think once you figure that out, you have to figure out, okay, so what is the methodology that I'm using to conclude these conclusions that I'm having, right? Why do I trust in this methodology over other methodologies? Is it possible that another methodology could come in and supersede that methodology and show, better results? And why do I care about the results from this methodology in particular? What are the values that we're adjusting here? And that also goes into like what kind of variables you're looking at too, and whether or not it's possible that, what you believe is from another person's perspective could be believable, right? Because maybe somebody doesn't value the same methods that you do would come to those conclusions. And you have to look at, okay, well, are these methods better? Like, and can we even say that they're better in that sense? So especially with the quantum stuff, right? There's a lot of questions you can start asking yourself. But as Bryan was kind of putting at, there is kind of a belief triangle, which I talk about in one of my videos, if you want to check it out, of how you can kind of start at the top and kind of go down to the bottom and get to the heart of what it is. But yeah, it kind of goes in the kind of the order that I was describing. But there's a couple different ways to do it. There's not just one single method. So yeah.
So okay. So dovetailing off of that, because epistemology, I think you said something important in there, and it's like when we're talking about quantum, when we're talking about certain ideas that are so extremely complex that scientists who have devoted their entire lives to studying these things don't actually understand what it is that they're, defining. And then us lay people come along and try and co-opt these terms and say, well, we all work upon the various quantum vibrations that sends our consciousness out through the universe, vibrating on these 11 strings that comprise our cosmos. And, we can appropriate these terms that are they're nonsense, because we don't know what terms we're saying. We don't know how to actually use, scientific definitions that are that incredibly complex. So I think what you said is important, Dan, is that you have to define your terms, and even defining something in and of itself is an act of epistemology. When you are trying to label or apply a label to something, or, a belief, a thought, a feeling, an object that's sitting on the table, when you're putting a definition to that, that's where you need to kind of get the whole ball rolling. Is, what are we defining here? How do we define it? And then how do we know that that definition is accurate? And that seems to kind of form the foundation for a lot of epistemological assumptions or conversations about this subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes down to it, the biggest thing you have to consider is, if I had to sum it down to one question, it would be, what assumptions am I making, right? And that can mean different things in different contexts. And often when you're having a conversation with other people, especially when it's about beliefs, instead of figuring out why is a huge part of it, but also it's figuring out, okay, well, what are the assumptions that are happening here? And can you get to the heart of that? Because, okay, so let's say, right, you want to convince somebody that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, because that's a belief you have. If you show them, I don't know, a couple of textbooks maybe that say otherwise, okay, well, maybe they don't actually value those textbooks. Maybe they don't really understand. They don't have a reason to believe why those methods are any better than the methods they're already using, maybe the Bible or otherwise, to determine, what's true. So if you're spending all this time trying to collect evidence and be like, oh, look here, this is going to demonstrate that you're wrong, and you just need to listen to this, you're honestly wasting your time, because you haven't addressed how they're coming to the beliefs that they're coming to in the first place, which is super, super important when you're having conversations like this.
So then now I have another question, and Colleen, you might be able to speak to this better, because you and Dan, it sounds like you've been practicing a little bit on this, but are there any beliefs or any things that may enter into this discussion that are not impacted by a conversation about epistemology? Are there any, maybe, any sacred cows of epistemology that even the Socratic method can't touch?
Gosh, are there beliefs that can't be touched? I don't know. You'd have to ask a real epistemologist, somebody that has a PhD in these things, maybe. I'll tell you this. I've had conversations about all kinds of stuff. Everything from religion to politics to, you name it. It's been really, really fun. I haven't, if I find something that doesn't work with the method, I'll let you know. But I don't know if I can think of any beliefs that really you can't break down to some level.
That's not to say that there aren't things that people consider sacred cows and just won't consider. But given someone with at least a mind to discuss their beliefs about belief X, I can't really think of anything either.
And Colleen, earlier you were talking about like these spiritualist kind of beliefs, not essential oils. No, of course not. What have you found in your explorations of epistemology that might be some of these sacred cows?
Well, so let's take essential oils, for example, because that's one of the discussions that we had. Somehow it came up, and because I was asking what woo was. I'm like, what the hell is this woo thing that I keep talking about? And so he described it as, it's like essential oils, stuff like that. And I was like, wait, hold up, I have essential oils. And he's like, well, do you believe that essential oils could take the effects? And I'm like, well, no, but I believe that I believe in aromatherapy. And so he's like, oh, you do? What is aromatherapy to you? And so we just kind of start the ball rolling and pick out things and talk about it. And so I don't know, for me, I'm a hippie at heart. I would believe in all of the hippy dippy things that I could. My logic often defeats my desire a hippy dippy. I would totally buy all of the woo things, except at the end of the day, I'm like, yeah, I know that's not true, and I'll be sad about it. But I still have that desire. And so in defining aromatherapy, I'm like, well, it makes me feel good. And he's like, well, tell me about that. He'll do the street epistemology on, well, what does that mean? And so, it's not a sacred cow or anything, but it's one of those things onto it a little bit. But doing street epistemology helps me kind of find the root of what it is I want to hold on to, or what it is that actually is truth to me. And so, even in that conversation, I, could get down to the words to say, I like the way they smell, and smells make me happy, and therefore, essential oils can put me in a better mood, and that's it. So therefore they work for me. It's not going to cure cancer, but I kind of like smelling them every once in a while. So.
I wonder, because as far as I understand it, I may be remembering this falsely from Anthony Magnabosco's various guest appearances, cognitive dissonance, scathing atheists and stuff. But if I remember correctly, he took Peter Boghossian's book, Manual for Creating Atheists, and just dissected the Socratic method that's at the bottom of it. And that kind of started him down the path of, going out and accosting people on the street and, starting his YouTube channel, Street Epistemology. So that, it seems like that if you're going to go about it that way, that requires a fair amount of, chutzpah to just go out and randomly find people and say, hey, can I talk to you about something you deeply believe in? Is there any subjects that people do sincerely believe in that maybe we should steer clear of? And in the context of like when people say that I know that I'm a good person because I believe in X, that I am a moral person because I know that X or Y is watching over me. And if I didn't have that belief, then I'd be a mass murderer, then I'd do this, then who knows what kind of a person I would be. Is it a good idea to try and broach a conversation with those people and get down to the fundamental aspects of why they believe that, when they may believe sincerely that if they don't have that belief, that they're going to be a mass murderer?
I would say, I'll keep this quick, Dan.
I was gonna say I think Bryan should talk since he hasn't been able to talk for a while. He probably has a good answer for this. So,
well, and I've actually seen this on a number of, I think, Anthony Magnabosco's videos where, when it comes to a point where they're like, I just need this. They're either in a point of their life where they're just going through, they have cancer, or someone they know has cancer, and it's the only thing getting them through. I know Anthony, he just like, okay, have a good day. And he stops it right there. And so, yeah, I would do be aware. I mean, we're kind of talking about this clinically, but like Street Epistemology is talking with actual people. And it's important not to forget that human aspect. Just because we have this cool tool doesn't mean that we should necessarily use it in every situation. So yeah, I would say like if someone's getting upset, or they're like, I really need this, or I just would lose all hope. Yeah, you should probably just, okay, well, have a nice day. And if it's someone yeah, maybe you should back off a little bit.
I think that goes back to a lot of the conversations that I've had with Bryan. Sometimes it gets down to the placebo effect. And sometimes like, I'm like, well, I know back in the back of my head that it's bullshit. But at the same time, like, I like kind of believing in it because it can kind of help me feel better. And there's this mental, emotional placebo effect where it doesn't really matter. It's not life or death whether I believe it or not, but there's some placebo effect to wanting to believe it that makes let's just move on. I don't know. That's, I kind of, and a situation for me, but just sometimes I'm like, well, I'm happier believing in that. So I kind of want to.
So,
sorry, just to respond to Colleen a little bit, and maybe give her a little pushback. At that point, in Colleen's case, since I have some background with her, a little bit of a rapport, I might say, okay, well, I would just say maybe you should consider, okay, is this belief and like believing in it, is there a chance that it might bleed into something where I'm using a faulty epistemology to come to some other conclusion that might actually have harmful results? So I would just say, keep that in mind. I mean, I know she's like, in the back of my head, I know it's placebo effect. And so I think she is keeping that in the back of her mind, or I should talk to you directly. Sorry, Colleen. I know, I'm pretty sure you are keeping that, but that would be kind of my response. Like, is there a danger to having a faulty epistemology? And I would probably couch it in maybe simpler terms for someone else, but since we've been talking about it, is there a danger for using a method that is not reliably bringing us to true conclusions, true meaning Matt Dillahunty's as it comports with reality? Could we then accidentally, not realizing it, use it for something else and end up in a harmful situation like essential oils, where we're like spending money and expecting it to cure cancer or something, and it might not even be that drastic, so we might not be able to identify it.
That's good pushback. I appreciate it. And this is another thing that I enjoy doing is I'll kind of process in my mind, like, well, what are my beliefs? And across something, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to like have someone do street epistemology on me on this belief, because I want to know myself better. So I'll be like, okay, can we do this one? Like, here, ask me about this. I need to. So it's kind of like me using Bryan or whatever, and be like, okay, ask me questions. I want to know more about this particular belief of my own. So I really appreciate street epistemology for that, because I think it can benefit even the person, not only the person asking the questions, obviously, but it really benefits the person answering the questions, and not like not always in a, planting seeds of doubt type of a way, but also in like, let's explore why we believe what we believe sort of a way. And I really appreciate that.
So I'm kind of struck with this as well, and maybe we can get Dan to chime in on this. One thing that is so often, I get frustrated when I'm interacting with believers online, and even this happens with non-believers as well, that there isn't exactly a single event that most of us can point to and say that this is what shattered my belief system in X. Oftentimes it's a process for all of us. And, Dan, it sounds like you had, a 1.5 to 2 year experience where you had a kind of a coming away from Jesus type of process. There isn't the magic silver bullet for critical thinking and for skepticism. It's a matter of processing a lot of information, oftentimes that has been inculcated in our minds for, years and sometimes even generations, and trying to deprogram away from that. And it seems like epistemology might be one way to try and analyze where that programming has come into play. Why do I believe this? Well, because I was, born in Utah. I was born in the covenant. That's why I'm Mormon, right? And I know oftentimes in Anthony Magnabosco's videos, he'll say, well, I was just talking to a Muslim person. I was just talking to a Hare Krishna. I was talking to these people, and they came to their beliefs the same way that it sounds like you have. What makes yours right and theirs wrong? And it does point to the cultural programming that tends to happen a lot when you're indoctrinating children and indoctrinating people into a belief system. And once again, there isn't that magic bullet to get people out of it. Dan, I want to kick it over to you a little bit. How do you feel like in your 1.5, 2 year process of deconversion that epistemology played into that deprogramming process?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about stuff that's usually taboo, there's like it's hard to think of it in objective ways, especially when you're talking with people who don't believe the same things you do. So, I mean, obviously, I think you can tell the kind of effects that's had on me for sure. It's, oh, sorry, I'll be right back.
I'll pop in.
Yeah.
And so, you're talking about how you can't really pinpoint the silver bullet that kind of changed your belief. And yeah, a lot of people form their beliefs through a collage of different reasons. And I would say, yeah, it's kind of like a basket. And so you say, okay, well, let's look at the basket of your beliefs. And you've got a whole bunch of different items in there. Let's take one out, look at it. Okay, so this is you believe in God, because it's the example that's coming to mind. You believe in God because of the Bible, and there's historical evidence for it. It's like, okay, well, then you start just taking them out and say, well, if we took this away, would your confidence decrease? And sometimes, if you were to have a scale, well, let's say, yeah, it would decrease maybe a little bit, like 1 or 2%. But then you find one, it's like, oh yeah, that would go down like 30%. So you're like, okay, well, let's focus on this one because this is the biggest one we've come by so far. And so, yeah, it does help you kind of, you could have, a lot of things that have different weights, and I would probably focus on the item or belief that had the largest weight, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm wondering exactly how we want to transition into this, because I'd like to try and do a demonstration of street epistemology here, maybe a couple of them. So because Colleen, it sounds like you really enjoy being on the receiving end of a street epistemology questioner, and Dan, of course, you host your own street epistemology show. I wonder if you two wouldn't mind, maybe, Colleen, is there something that's on your mind today, something woo related, that you think is super awesome that we could do a little demonstration with?
Oh,
Sorry
God.
for putting you on the spot.
No, I mean, God.
How about Brian? Brian, you got anything?
Yeah, Brian, have any woo?
Because we talked before about it. Maybe we can get somebody new.
Yeah, I've thought about this a number of times, and I've made attempts to be SE'd.
Or hey, maybe can we do this? We have some other people in the chat.
Yeah, what about Nick?
Oh, I actually have one for Nick. If he's on the line, he might have stepped away from, but I know when I recently visited Nick, he, if I remember correctly, wanted to chart out my astrological sign. I see you nodding, Nick. Maybe we can dig into that. Oh, not
You are on mute, Nick.
Let me see. There we go. Can we hear Nick?
Guys.
Hey,
there we go.
So yeah, I have a passion for astrology. It's something that I've, growing up, I was like I actually grew pretty fascinated by it, and that it actually seems like it's pretty accurate.
So sorry, Nick, can you repeat that? Because it cut out like a bad internet connection. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I apologize. I was basically just saying that I really enjoyed astrology after I learned that it works, whereas before I didn't like it because horoscopes were BS. Does that work?
Yeah.
I think
I'd like to know the difference between astrology and horoscopes. Like, I don't know enough about it, but I'd like to explore the difference.
Yeah, I would too. I don't know what to say on it. I'm not really that well versed to really say too much more. Besides, natal charts are basically a picture of the sky the moment you're born, whereas astrology just covers everything in a nutshell, I guess.
So, do you currently believe that natal charts like have an effect on reality, like they determine things from your birth?
I don't think that the natal charts specifically determine anything. I think the natal chart more or less is a description of what's to come.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, look at your natal chart and see if it's accurate or not. I mean, I looked at my natal chart and it just kind of blew my mind. I've looked at other people's natal charts that I know, and they just describe the person to a T. Okay.
So that's interesting. So you found a couple people who you think have kind of described your charts pretty well. Mm-hmm. Do you think if we got like a really large sample size, like if we got like 1 million people, maybe, like how many people do you think would like find that their charts are like convincing?
Well, I think as long as they had an accurate chart, they would. I think almost everyone would find their chart very convincing.
Okay, and what does an accurate chart look like to you?
Now, this is interesting. I did my wife's chart and we were off. She didn't know exactly what time she was born. She thought it was about 1:30. So we just did a rough estimate of about 1:30. And as I was reading her chart, I was like, this all sounds really good, except something is off. There's something off in this reading that isn't adding up. This isn't. And so as I did a little more research, I realized I was off by 7 minutes. She was actually born at 1:37 p.m., which changed the chart enough in one of her signs to where her rising sign was no longer a Libra, it was a Scorpio, and the reading was much more accurate for her.
That's really fascinating. So, gosh, okay, so do you think that there's a specific reason why these charts are accurate? Like, is there some sort of mechanism in place? Is it supernatural, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I honestly don't know why they work. It just seems every single person's chart is unique, and I think that's the blueprint, kind of like the DNA in the charts, so to speak.
That's interesting. Does anybody want to ask from here?
If you came across someone whose natal chart did not match their personality, would that decrease your confidence in natal charts?
No, not necessarily, because I feel like natal charts go much deeper than just personality.
Okay, so maybe if it didn't describe to the depth accurately, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about natal charts. I kind of Googled them a little bit, but I haven't been able to pull one up yet. So it's personality. What else does it cover?
I'd have to look again. I'm not exactly sure. Basically, it's just a snapshot of like what your life is going to be, like what reality holds for you as a person.
So kind of like these kinds of events will happen in your life. Is that kind of what?
I think you can read that into some natal charts. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just trying to get an idea of what it's telling you. Because horoscopes in general are like, you are this kind of a person, or maybe this is, it's mostly a personality description in general terms.
I would say the reason horoscopes fail is because they're only looking at one aspect of the natal chart. They're looking at your sun sign, or they're looking at, usually it's just one aspect of your natal chart. Whereas the natal chart as a whole is looking at hundreds and hundreds of aspects of your personality and your life.
Okay. So let's say let's say there's 100 aspects and you look at them and 75 of them match, but you miss on 25. Would that decrease your confidence?
What defines a miss?
That's a good question. What does define a miss? And if you can't define a miss, is it really something that you can be confident that you know it's a hit?
It's a good point too.
So let's say hypothetically we knew what a miss and a hit was, and it hit 75% of the time. Would that make your confidence go up or down?
I feel like with astrology, I don't feel like you're going to have anything less than 100%. I feel like it's a pretty flawless science. I know people call it a pseudoscience, but I feel like it's a pretty darn accurate science. I mean, I don't know, that's just my take on it.
So you think it would be either 100% or not reliable?
As long as it's interpreted correctly, I feel like it's 100% reliable.
Okay. And if it was interpreted correctly and it wasn't reliable, would that decrease your confidence that it is?
Oh, totally. If you're going to misinterpret the chart, then then there's going to be inaccuracies, and then it's unreliable.
So,
well, I was saying. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
If I may cut in, Brian, what exactly is the method that you use to determine whether an interpretation is correct or not?
That's a good question too, because there's a lot of different fields of astrology. There's aerial astrology. There's a lot of different ways you can go about interpreting.
If I may make a point, and this usually doesn't happen with a lot of conversations where the person asking questions usually doesn't make a point, but sometimes you can if you want to make something under consideration. Let's say that I find one interpretation that doesn't match up, that I find another one that does, and then that same source gives me an interpretation that doesn't work out the next time, and I find a different source that says yes. If I'm just trying to find things that match up, I'm kind of looking at it backwards almost. You can almost say you're looking at the results and working backwards to see which one works and taking it in without taking in what's happening beforehand, if you see what I'm saying. Especially when it comes to like star sign stuff. It seems to me, unless there's a category that can be defined, it's almost like it's hard to tell, okay, well, how do we know that we're not just coming, it's almost the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, right? You're throwing the dart at the barn and you're drawing the target afterwards, right?
As far as like a natal chart?
Yeah, for sure.
No, I don't.
Do you think that's possible?
I feel like with natal charts, I mean, you have one shot, and you have what you have, and you can't change it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Any other questions from you guys?
From your perspective, Nick, what would falsify natal charts?
Just like I said, a poor interpretation. So like, let's say someone was looking at Mars and Scorpio, and they are totally like just trying to say it has something to do with your relationship with your mother. And obviously Mars and Scorpio has nothing to do with your relationship with your mother. So obviously this astrologer is just doing really bad astrology. That would be one example of a false interpretation.
So when I mean falsify, what would prove that natal charts were not accurate? So if you say, oh yeah, it's a bad interpretation, you're throwing that data out and still considering natal charts to be accurate. So what test or what information could you receive hypothetically that would get you to say, oh yeah, natal charts are not accurate. They're not actually predicting, and I apologize, I'm trying to speak generically because I don't know enough about natal charts to really get the right vocabulary. So what information could you receive hypothetically that would make you say, oh, I don't think natal charts are accurate? Is that the right term? Or are predictive?
I kind of see what you're asking. I don't know how to answer that though.
Okay, that's fine.
So something to point out here, the goal of having conversations like these isn't necessarily to change somebody's mind, right? We're just kind of examining and evaluating each other's beliefs. And if the person I'm talking to says, oh, I never thought about that before, let me think about that some more, that's a win in my book, right? Because that shows that people have learned something and you're actually getting somewhere, and it's all really good. Let me ask you something, Nick. Again, this is a very specific thing to ask because we're in a specific circle of people. Are you aware of Barnum Statements?
Barnum, I'm not sure who.
Yeah, so Barnum Statements are these kinds of general descriptions, and this is what is often criticized about astrology. They make these descriptions that are very, very general and applicable to a lot of people, that make people seem like it's very specific and unique to them. A really great example of this was James Randi had a class of people where he made this paragraph of a description about a person. And he asked the people in the class, okay, if this is unique to you, go ahead and check yes on this little poll, right? And it turns out everybody in the class said yes to their individual descriptions. But each description was actually the exact same description. But the statements that were made were so general and so broad enough but they felt like they were unique, that people were able to say, yes, this describes me in a nutshell. Do you think that it's possible that natal charts could be something similar, in that a lot of people can take the data that they're looking at and interpret that into their, their own lives?
I mean, I personally don't think so. I personally feel like natal charts are accurate, and if every person looked at their natal chart, they would see, because only we know ourselves internally, and I feel like those natal charts talk about some of those things that only we know personally. So in order to falsify your natal chart, sorry, I apologize for the loud kids. In order for your natal chart to be falsified, I feel like you would have to falsify it yourself.
Okay, so are you saying that if I found your natal chart, yours specifically, and I read that, I could actually learn information about you that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to know unless you had told me?
Yeah, I'd almost say sacred information.
Okay, interesting.
Do you think, have you ever done a test where you gave someone a natal chart that you didn't know? You said, okay, here's my information. Look up my natal chart, and used that information to, I don't know, predict something about you that they otherwise would not have known. Have you ever tried that before?
No, I haven't actually. That's a good thing. That's an interesting thing I'd like to try actually.
Sorry, Bryce, go ahead.
I'd be interested in that. That'd be cool.
So, Nick, I'm sorry that I just kind of threw you under the bus, but I just knew that was a subject that you and I had conversed on previously, and you were very open to share it, and I appreciate you being open to briefly analyzing it here on the panel. I think that was fun. Well done, everybody. Very, very interesting. So I guess we're getting kind of close to wrapping up here, and I would like to try a little street epistemology here, in the way that I know the method of SE, and I happen to have a belief right now in my mind that I would like to try and defend while knowing what methods and tactics are going to be used with SE, to see if there is any defensible way to sidestep it or to get out of the crushing blow of the hammer swing of SE. So who wants to be my epistemologist for the next little while?
Ooh. Does it have to be me? Is that what it looks like?
I can take a crack again, but it seems I'm partially tempted to say, Colleen, you want to give it a try?
I'm also tempted to say Colleen.
Oh, well, I need more lessons from you guys before I can jump in. I will try.
So maybe we can take turns. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
take turns on.
I like what we were doing.
I like it that way. Yeah.
And maybe Dan, if you want to maybe use it kind of as a teaching situation too. I know, just like for Colleen, be like, okay, maybe if you want to pipe in and say, oh, this is where, let him think, or, do the Anthony Magnabosco teaching style.
Yeah. Before we do that, can we just, can we break down the conversation that just happened right now? I feel like there's some interesting things we could talk about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think, Nick, that was really an awesome belief to tackle. I think what's really cool about this conversation is it's made up of very well articulate people, and also people. I mean, Nick, you sound fairly confident in your belief. We didn't actually ask you on a scale how confident you were, but it sounded very confident. So you were able to talk about that into a lot of depth. One thing that we also were able to do was, I think we were able to ask a few questions where you could say, well, have you ever done this? Or have you ever thought about your beliefs this way? And some of the things you said, yeah, totally. And some other things you said, well, maybe, we could try it sometime in the future. And to me, I think that represents a really successful conversation, because like I was kind of saying earlier, my criteria is more, okay, are we thinking about things that we haven't thought about before? which I think was really cool. So like, and also I've never talked to anybody about natal charts before, so that was really new for me, and now I have something I can look into more. So like, I don't know the common responses to like natal charts. I don't know what that looks like. So it's something for me to kind of be interested in, and I think a lot of good stuff was happening there. So yeah, I just thought we could break that down. I thought it was cool.
Another thing I wanted to ask to Nick, how did you feel? Like, did you feel attacked, or how was your feelings during that?
No, I didn't feel attacked at all. I actually felt like that was a good conversation. I enjoy sharing my thoughts and feelings about astrology because it's a subject I've spent many hours diving into and I feel pretty passionate about. So I appreciate you guys, asking me the questions and diving a little deeper.
Yeah, for sure. It can be a bit different when there's lots of people talking at once, as opposed to just a one-on-one conversation. So the dynamics kind of change. And sometimes, especially when you get into a good line of questioning, I experienced this on the show. It's like, oh no, right, I really want to keep going to see where this is going. Like, don't take this away from me, because sometimes you can get into the root stuff. So I think that's something to keep in mind if you're practicing this and you want to try it out. I recommend just trying with one-on-one conversations first and see where those go.
And I would also encourage Nick, Dan's show is every Friday night at 6 Central. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. And, he does street epistemology as a hobby. So I think that you would be an amazing call-in if you felt the desire deep in your heart to do that. I think that could make for some really good airtime to hear a conversation between the two of you, really diving deep down into exactly what are natal charts.
A warm burning in your bosom of desire.
That's right. Yes, for it is good and delightsome. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the tail end of the conversation here. So I have a sincerely held belief that I would like to try and get to the bottom of, and use my best mental wiles to elude the silver bullet that is epistemology. And I guess anybody on the panel can ask or can expound on this, can practice the method. But I am for the next 20 minutes, about, if our show goes long tonight, I am a Joseph Smithicist. I believe that Joseph Smith was a mythical figure, that he never actually existed, and that he was completely fabricated basically by Fawn Brodie in the 1940s. So
wow, okay,
your belief.
Cool. So I think one thing to point out is you are very quick to define exactly what it is you believe. Yes. So normally when you first start having conversations with this, like I said before, you start with the definitions. I mean, you went right for exactly what you mean. So I almost don't even have to ask any clarifying questions. So the next natural response to this is, first things first, what is your biggest reason? Because I'm sure you have several reasons, but what is the reason that gives you the most confidence in that your belief is true?
Well, I'm much of the opinion that a lot of like Jesus mythicists are, where there may very well have been a Jesus that fits the picture of some kind of shamanic rabbi living in Judea around the time of Jesus, but that the Gospels that were written about him don't actually reflect a real person. It's just a mythological version of maybe a real person that exists. And there are, on census records, the name Joseph Smith crops up everywhere throughout America. It's an extremely generic name throughout the 1800s. And there may have been a Joseph Smith that may have done some of the things that the prophet of the Restoration, as he's known today, has done, but most of it has just been completely fabricated and mythologized. And the Joseph Smith we know today is mostly a creation of the 20th century.
Okay, so now I think I can actually ask a few more clarifying questions here. So you say a creation of the 20th century. So when you say that, do you mean that all evidence that we have of Joseph Smith ever existed like it, and we're talking about eyewitness accounts, census things. Do you think it was the
It's all
creation?
fabricated. It's all
Okay,
fabricated.
so was it by a group of people? Was it by a single person? Do you have any specifics as to what you think it is, or is that just your belief in general?
It was largely the creation of Brigham Young. He was doing so much on the back end to fabricate documentation and affidavits, journal entries, collecting the affidavits of his supposed wives that, were never actually married to him. And it was all a major conspiracy by Brigham Young, and he created all of that documentation. Maybe single-handedly. He probably had help from Willard Richards until his death in 1852, and a lot from John Taylor, because John Taylor was the third prophet, and John Taylor was the guy that Brigham Young actually spared in the Carthage jail shootout. So John Taylor and Brigham Young were kind of at the head of all of this, and Lorenzo Snow was sort of parenthetically involved, but not really deeply in the actual fabrication of it. And then most of what we know from the historiography of Joseph Smith, that's all of creation of, well, mostly Fawn Brodie, but she was also working hand in hand with B.H. Roberts. B.H. Roberts, of course, preceded Fawn Brodie by, half a generation, but a lot of their timeline overlapped in that Brigham H. Roberts was the believing Mormon historian, and Fawn Brodie was the apostate female evil historian, who they went through and collected all of these affidavits, all of this information that was completely fabricated by Brigham Young, and they wrote it and created this fabricated history of Joseph Smith based on all of that documentation. And they knew it the whole time along, too. They both knew it, that Joseph Smith wasn't a real person when they were writing about him.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot. And that's so cool because you get so specific and you have this very detailed plan. I think that's really awesome. Do you know of, actually, I should say, any evidence that Brigham Young specifically and all the cohorts that you mentioned did this? Because you've made a very particular case. You've made like very particular speculation, I'd say, that this is the case. Is there any because there might be evidence that suggests otherwise, but what gives you evidence? Or what do you think warrants the evidence that this theory, this idea, this speculation of how the history works is true above all other ideas?
Well, I just see Joseph Smith follows a similar Masonic trajectory of a dying and rising heroic figure. So when it comes to his running through the woods with the gold plates, that was the story of that was basically rooted in the passion narrative of Masonry of Hiram Abiff being killed by the three other Masons in Solomon's Temple. And there's many similar themes, and that's obviously why there's contradictions as to whether he was attacked by one man or two men or three men, and did he actually break his thumb? There's so much speculation surrounding it. That's because it was all a fabricated passion narrative based on Joseph Smith's early life. It's just like, Genghis Khan's passion narrative when he was a young kid, he killed his brother. It's just like Alexander the Great did the same thing. It's just like Jesus, when he was 12 years old, he was, in the temple talking to the Pharisees and teaching them particulars of the Jewish faith. There are always, with these heroic figures that we have, there are always these early life passion narratives that play out, and Joseph Smith follows the pattern of all of these similarly mythical people.
Well, okay, so sounds like your strongest reason is you draw these similarities between other figures in history, or supposed figures in history, rather, mythologized figures in history, and you see kind of a pattern between what happens to their stories and what happened with Joseph Smith. And based on that inference, you're able to come to the conclusion that Joseph Smith is also a myth, essentially.
Yeah. It's just teasing out patterns
okay.
that, demonstrate themselves over and over. But I think Bryan actually had a few clarifying questions quite a ways back.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question before Bryan does, if I may? is it possible that a figure in history could be real and also have mythological elements to him? For example, like Abraham, or I'd say George Washington, there's a story of the apple tree, right? Or they cut it down and stuff. And that story may not be true, but it still could be true that George Washington is true, right?
Yes. So I think it's just a matter of weighing out the preponderance of evidence that it's from outside sources of whether or not they existed, and ascertaining whether or not that tips the balance of evidence in favor that they are indeed a real human being, and as opposed to just a fabricated mythical person. And I don't think that there's anything that I have seen of evidence for Joseph Smith that actually tips the balance of evidence in his favor.
Okay, I'm tag teaming it out with Bryan now.
I'm actually going to bring it back to the what phase just to clarify a few things. So I can, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, let's say there was a dude named Joe, and he was walking around and he, created a church. Well, he didn't even necessarily create a church, but people used him and his personality to create this mythical figure. And you can have degrees where on one it's like we completely made up this guy, didn't even have something to base it on. And then a degree of scale to where, okay, then there kind of was a guy and it was loosely based on him. And we move over and there was, okay, he did some stuff and then we added miracles on top. And then, he did some miracles or things that appeared like miracles. And so I'm just wondering where exactly on that scale or spectrum are you kind of placing this mythicism? Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, Joseph Smith was purely a mythical figure. There was no Joseph Smith that did any of what the Joseph Smith we know of today did. It was all purely a fabrication of Brigham Young.
Okay. So did Brigham, now I'm kind of curious, and this is kind of jumping out of SE, did Brigham Young, where did he get his start? Was there a group of followers that he jumped into, or did he create the followers?
It was largely him. It was so much because Brigham Young was just a dude in, just traveling in Europe. And he came up with this idea that he's going to create a religion. And, this was in 1839, 1840, and he created the religion out there basically. And then he was able to get, thousands of people to immigrate to America. And when they got there, that's when they realized that Joseph Smith wasn't a real figure, that everything was run by Brigham Young. And then when mob violence got too much, Brigham Young decided to drag them all out to, Mexico, that, became Utah territory. But then because he was such a totalitarian dictator, he was able to swear all of them to secrecy.
Okay, cool. So that was kind of just the clarification I wanted to make. Back to the SE, what kind of evidence would falsify this? Would it be a birth certificate? I know a lot of Christians say, oh, the bones of Jesus. Is there something like that that you would kind of falsify this idea?
No, that's a really tough question, really, because there was just a release on, I think it was on Mormon Newsroom, that the church is going to begin exhibiting the death clothes of Joseph Smith, the clothes he was wearing when he was supposedly killed in Carthage jail. And, it's all propaganda, right? It's all perpetuated by the Brighamite church itself. And all of the other factions were created solely in opposition to Brigham Young based on this mythical figure. It's like, all of the Gnostic sects and all of the other, pre-Catholic Christian sects that started up. And, once Catholicism, really started gaining traction in the late 3rd, early 4th century, that's when it began squashing out all of these other groups, these other rival Christianities. Brigham Young tried to do the same thing to the other versions of Mormonism that were created just solely to oppose him. But because the West was the West, and most of those were in the Midwest states, in, you know, far east of where Brighamite Mormons were. Brigham didn't have as much control over there, so he couldn't actually effectively squash them out. He was only able to kill a few of them.
Could potentially some kind of documents that were, I'm just kind of spitballing this, so some kind of documents that were found created after Brigham Young left. Well, I'm not sure if this is going to pan out the way I'm thinking it is. Let's say we found some documents that were post Brigham Young's influence on the East Coast. I'm not sure if this is even possible.
No, not at all. Like, I think I know where you're going with the question, but no, Brigham had missionaries. He didn't have armies everywhere in the world, but he had missionaries everywhere. I mean, I think it was 1851 or 52 was the first Mormon missionaries out to the Hawaiian Islands, right? So, like, he had missionaries everywhere, traveling the entire United States, planting evidence. I mean, that's what you do with a good orchestration of a conspiracy, and Brigham Young was the best.
Now I'm going to have, what would you say about a belief that's non-falsifiable, since I know you're also a skeptic?
So this is, it is falsifiable, and I could be shown the remains of the claimed Joseph Smith and say that causes me to question my sincerely held beliefs here. I would need to see a DNA analysis on it. I would need to know that there is a descendant, a living descendant today who is, an actual descendant of Joseph Smith. And I would need to see their, patrilineal DNA matched up. And I would need to know more about DNA in order to be able to ascertain for myself whether or not that is an actual, patrilineal DNA sequence or not. There are ways to falsify it, but all of the evidence, I've been studying Mormon history for 5-6 years almost now, and I have come across absolutely nothing that falsifies my beliefs.
I was under the impression that there was DNA, and because I know there's been a number of times where it's like, oh, this is a potential polygamous daughter of Joseph Smith, and they track down the lineage, and then it hasn't panned out yet. But don't they have some kind of DNA for Joseph Smith?
There are people that claim that they are the children of Joseph Smith, but because he was a mythical figure, he couldn't actually have children. So those were likely just orphans that were raised up by somebody and told their entire lives that they are the son of the founding prophet of Mormonism. And Joseph F. Smith is a perfect example of this. I mean, he was just an orphan that Brigham Young picked up off the streets, and he was able to teach Joseph F. Smith that he was the son of Hiram Smith. His uncle was the great Joseph Smith Jr. that founded Mormonism. And then Joseph F. Smith, he was prophet from, I think 1901 or something to 1920s, 1915, something like that. And he was basically solely responsible for streamlining Mormonism and for eradicating polygamy so that Mormonism would be acceptable to the rest of Christianities in America at the time. So, you can see the concerted efforts of Brigham Young to bring people in and brainwash them to think that they knew at some point they knew Joseph Smith, or to make them think that they are descendants of Joseph Smith, but there's no hard evidence that proves that they ever were.
Could we test Joseph F. Smith's DNA against Joseph Smith Jr., the RLDS prophet, or one of his descendants? Because couldn't we make a familial link there?
I don't know how DNA works, and I don't. That might falsify my beliefs, but
or confirm it.
But I'm of the opinion, because no analysis like that has ever been done that I've seen, at least. Therefore, that means that no analysis like that even exists. And I don't think I'm fairly certain that it would just confirm my beliefs.
Okay, let me back it up a little bit. So I hear this explanation of Brigham Young being the sole proprietor of the entire Joseph Smith franchise, along with several cohorts. And I think I see this as an explanation for what could possibly what we see. And what we see is lots and lots of documents. We see lots and lots of stories from lots of people describing all kinds of events. And you're kind of interpreting this data, and you're saying this is all the result of a small group of people, specifically one man in particular, kind of orchestrating this. And I think that's a really strong claim to make. And I can see the patterns that you're describing as well, as far as what this looks like compared to what other kind of stories look like. But do you have any specific evidence that it was Brigham Young and his cohorts? Do you have any documents saying, yes, I did this? Or where does this specific belief come from besides fitting the patterns?
So that's kind of the problem, because there's been a 160 plus year concerted effort to fabricate the Joseph Smith that we know today, largely orchestrated by Brigham Young and the Brighamite Church after he was dead. And they've fabricated this mountain of evidence, and they have completely summarily destroyed any evidence that would prove to the contrary whatsoever. Okay. So the thing is it's been a massive, it's finding a needle in a needle stack, really, to find the single document of Brigham Young saying that, hey, me, Heber C. Kimball, Willard Richards, we teamed up and we, created Joseph Smith. And you have to understand that the church itself controls most of the documents in their archive that Brigham Young fabricated, and that document would never be allowed to surface if it hasn't been destroyed by now. So there isn't documentary evidence for this, which you would understand a massive multi-billion-dollar Masonic corporation like the church, they're never going to let information like that ever out.
Sure. Me? But do you believe that it's possible? So, for example, if we had a document or some sort of archaeological evidence that we could carbon test through like carbon dating, assuming that's a method you find reliable, and we found that it was created or in existence before Brigham Young was even born, that points to the existence of Joseph Smith. If something like that were to be found, would that lower your confidence in your belief?
That couldn't possibly be done, because Brigham Young lived, Brigham Young, I think he was just a couple of years younger than the mythical Joseph Smith. That dude had years and years to fabricate documents to create this mythical Joseph Smith. So if you were trying to analyze a specific document that may have been written by Joseph Smith, that may have come from 1833 or 34 or something to that effect, Brigham Young was alive at that time. He was probably dreaming up Mormonism in his mind that whole time, and in his basement fabricating documents, and eventually became, the dating methods would just date to when the mythical Joseph Smith was alive. Okay. That doesn't prove that Brigham Young didn't fabricate it.
I didn't realize Brigham Young was younger than Joseph Smith. So that's really interesting. So you think that, or your belief is that their contemporary nature only adds to the evidence that Joseph Smith could potentially be a mythical figure.
Yes, that's correct.
Interesting. Okay, so there really is no method then that you can think of.
And that's the thing, is I'm open-minded to finding a method that would falsify my convictions here. And unfortunately, it's not a testimony, Colleen. Great question, though. But I'm sure that there is some kind of evidence out there that would prove, my beliefs false, but I've never come across it. I'm open-minded to it, but I don't think that it exists, because I've spent, years researching this, and it's never come across my path. So
that's fascinating.
Walker, you unmuted. Do you want to throw some questions around? Nope, back to muted. Okay. All right. Whose questions can I eviscerate next? Knuckle crack.
And this is one of those things where, as street epistemologists, we're at a slight disadvantage because you're much more well-read in all the deep history. And actually, disadvantage is the wrong word. It's not like we're in a competition here. So I'm not sure how much. I think you might have run all our questions. The only question I had now is how. What? Oh, well, I'm thinking, how can you see? I'm wondering what, and maybe you've already answered this. What method did you, or how did you tell or come to the conclusion that X and X documents were faked to start with?
So that really goes back to my understanding of seeing the, it's kind of the Campbell hero with 1,000 faces. You see so many themes in Joseph Smith's history that are so very clearly fabricated, and you see just a preponderance of these things, of these completely unbelievable scenarios happening. And eventually it's just only one small step further that you can conclude that Joseph Smith was just not a real person. So it's just a very simple conclusion based on all of the passion narratives that I'm aware of, and all of the hero narratives that I know, and so deeply intertwined with Masonry that, I see the patterns that have been teased out, and it strikes too many similar tendencies with all of those patterns to be a real human being.
Okay. Do you think that there are conflicting eyewitness testimonies on the character of Joseph Smith?
Absolutely, because that's how good Brigham Young was.
Okay, cool. So your idea is that Brigham Young actually created conflicting eyewitness testimonies in order to further make the existence of Joseph Smith?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Colleen, no questions from you yet. Anything to chime in with?
No, I wanted to know how far the conspiracy goes. Like,
so
when? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to. I had an interesting line, I think, with where I was going at. So if conflicting testimonies don't actually contribute to the realness of Joseph Smith, would you agree that you wouldn't know a testimony would actually contribute to his existence at all then, because you don't really have a method to identify what makes him more real or less real?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Sure. Okay, so let's say that we discovered another testimony tomorrow, right, of Joseph Smith. It sounds like you would have to say on your position that this was created. But how do we know that it was created? Is there a way we can tell just by looking at it whether it would be real or not real? Or do we have to assume that Joseph Smith is a mythical character?
You just so breaking the fourth wall for a second. Now I'm really conflicted because I know where I should go to play into an SE trap, and I know where the trap lies, and I'm really trying hard to avoid it. And this requires some fancy footwork conversationally.
SE only works if you're honest.
I was gonna point that out. I was like, the point is to, it actually does not work that well with like apologetics.
Ooh, disagree. Strong disagree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the apologist. I'm talking like professional apologists who are more about preaching and getting their information out than rather listening and considering their positions.
No, apologists, maybe not. Yes, apologetics.
That's what I was going.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking professional apologists is.
Yeah.
So, in a response, I'm going to punt on the question and play it at the SC trap and get back over to Colleen by saying that you just have to know more. You just have to have the experiences with Mormon history that I've had, and then you'll believe what I believe.
Okay. So personal experiences are a requirement for your belief.
See, that's why I wanted to not answer that one. Why I broke the fourth wall in the first place. But Colleen, it sounded like you were about to go into a line of questions.
I have two questions. First, you answered this and I missed it, but what was Brigham Young's purpose in creating the myth of Joseph Smith? Why they exist?
Yeah, he was one of the wealthiest human beings throughout his entire life. He had a legion of tens of thousands of followers who swore absolute fealty to him. He had an entire army. He just simply had a lot to gain out of it.
Brigham Young did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so I guess I don't understand though. So he had a lot to gain by creating an alter ego? Like, I don't understand why he wouldn't just take all that for himself. All that Joseph Smith represents.
Because he didn't want to die, right? If he can create a mythical figure, a holy pious prophet that can do no wrong, that was slain for his cause, died a martyr to the religion, and be the successor afterwards, he gets to live on. But there were so many religious martyrs in that day, in Joseph Smith's, the mythical Joseph Smith's day, that Brigham Young obviously was smart enough to recognize the follies of claiming to be speaking for God. So he had to fabricate this alter ego that died right as he was rising to prominence as a preacher.
Okay. What about Emma and Joseph Smith III? Are those also mythical creatures? Or not creatures, people?
Actually, yeah, Julie in the YouTube chat asked, did Brigham make up Joseph Smith III? No, he didn't. Actually, Joseph Smith III was the angry love child of Emma Bitterman and Brigham Young.
So, ooh. Okay.
He was able to indoctrinate Joseph Smith III in his very young ages, and he was able to get Emma on board with the conspiracy because she basically became the prophetess of her religion. So Emma and Brigham were kind of in cahoots with each other.
She would have had to lie to her own child for her own personal gain to start a new religion, right?
Yeah, nobody's ever done that before, right?
Well, no, because Joseph Smith doesn't exist, so no.
Joseph Smith III existed, Emma Bitterman existed, Brigham Young existed, but Joseph Smith Jr., no, not at all.
And what about, how far does it go? Does it end at Brigham Young, like when it comes to prophets?
Yeah, so Brigham Young was the beginning of all of it, and I think that by the time Joseph F. Smith came along, Brigham had indoctrinated him at such a young age that he had implanted false memories into the mind of Joseph F. Smith, that once Joseph F. Smith was prophet of the church, that's when they basically started with the new slate, and that's at the turn of the 20th century. So at that point, that's when all of the fabricated history was basically canonized in Mormonism, and Brigham Young was dead, John Taylor was dead, Lorenzo Snow was dead, Willard Richards was long dead. All of the OG conspirators, they were dead by the time Joseph F. Smith came along. And Joseph S. Smith just had been indoctrinated and brainwashed for so long that he truly believed that he was nephew of Joseph Smith and son of Hiram Smith. And he ran the religion. You know, that was kind of the turnover phase.
That's rich.
Yeah. See, this is stuff that not everybody talks about. This is deep. This is deep insider conspiracy stuff.
I
Where's
get
your
my tin hat. I
you're bored with yarn everywhere. No, just
You can't see it. I can't pan the camera over to it. It's fixed, but there it is.
one thing I wanted to circle back on. The witnesses, where the conflicting witnesses that you brought up with Brigham Young, where he fabricated conflicting witnesses accounts. Let's say they all more or less agreed. Would that make it less reliable?
No, not at all, because Brigham Young had a creative bandwidth that he couldn't exceed. He was a human being, right? He wasn't a demon that could just dream all of these things up out of nothing. Like, he had to come up with basically the Joseph Smith of Mormonism and then the Joseph Smith of anti-Mormonism. And he didn't have enough time to fabricate, you know, hundreds or thousands of different accounts that all disagreed. It was like there was the Mormon Joseph Smith that went in the garden at the age of 14, and then he started the religion in 1830. He wrote the Book of Mormon in 29 to 30 in a matter of 65 days. That's the Mormon Joseph Smith. And then there's the anti-Mormon Joseph Smith that colluded with Sidney Rigdon to write the Book of Mormon, that was a polygamist and a womanizer, and was convicted in 1826 for glass looking and was an occult practitioner. That's the anti-Mormon Joseph Smith. So he fabricated these two versions of Joseph Smith, and it so happens that the Mormon and the anti-Mormon Joseph Smiths, they agree internally with themselves, but they're kind of inextricably tied from each other. That's kind of where they butt heads. So if anything, if there are a whole bunch of outside accounts and scare quotes of the anti-Mormon Joseph Smith that all agree, I think that more points towards Brigham Young fabricating all of it than as opposed to Joseph Smith being a real person.
So I'm not sure if the question got lost there. So there's only two conflicting. Well, there's accounts on one side and the other side, and on each side they agree with each other.
Yeah.
But then they conflict. So let's say there were no sides and there were just only accounts that agreed with each other. Would that be evidence that it was not fabricated or that it was fabricated?
Probably that it was not fabricated, because that would show an abundance of consistency that we would tend to find if this was a real person.
Okay. Dan, did you have something to add to that? I know I saw you nodding your head.
No, I think you were doing great, because you were asking questions about method. You're asking questions about assumptions we make, like the data that we're looking at, whether it strongly points to what we believe or what we should believe or not, and whether we are looking for patterns. Yeah, I think it was really cool. I think I had a point, but I think I lost it. But yeah, it's just there's I don't know. I think we'd probably end this here.
I agree. Yeah.
We had a lot of good talks, but what do you think, Bryce? As someone who, let's say, has the least amount of knowledge in this particular field, asking you questions about the kind of questions I specifically asked you, do you think they were good questions, and do you think they worked for what they were trying to do? I could go on and do more, but...
Yes, and because I know enough, just barely enough about SE to know kind of the similar line of questioning that happens, I know that there were directions that it could have gone that would reveal the massive gaping chasms between the points that I was making, but it requires a fairly in-depth level of understanding of Mormon history and then also understanding, at least at a cursory level, street epistemology to understand why I was navigating the answers in such a way to basically keep you off of script. Because I never wanted you to get to the question of what percentage wise, if you were to go with, 0 to 100%, what degree of confidence would you ascribe that Joseph Smith is a mythical person? If you were getting into that and what would cause me to reduce that amount, that question never actually came out. That was where I was kind of afraid of the conversation going and where I didn't want to navigate, because you start running into landmines really fast as a conspiracy theorist when you start talking about degrees of certainty. So I was just able to craft the conversation in that way specifically because I knew where it was going to go and where you wanted to go. And basically, I just tried to bury you guys with bullshit. And for the purposes of keeping you off script, I think it, to a certain extent, worked.
Well, okay. I'll say this. I definitely see what you're trying to do, right? And the questions that specifically Ryan were asking was the ones I was like, yes. Because, I mean, you worded it a little bit better than what I did earlier. It's about degrees of confidence, and it's about the methodology. Like what points of data, what evidence is going to increase or decrease what you were talking about. Right. So I think we could have talked about that a little bit more. And I also wanted to let other people get their questions in and stuff. I think these two were definitely more concerned about the what, like specific details. I'm like, nah, we don't have to do that. But yeah, I gotta admit, I enjoyed hearing you come up with what you were saying. So that's fun too.
Well, and to be fair too, like the reason why I broke the fourth wall in the middle of your line of questioning was because I didn't really have anywhere to go to continue avoiding the true epistemology of how I know what I know. So that's why I had to break it and like sit back and think for a second, like, what am I going to say? How am I going to do this? Because, I mean, it shows that the method is effective, that I didn't have a ready answer. And if I truly believed that deep down, that Joseph Smith was a mythical figure, the line of questioning that you led me to would have forced me to say, I don't know. Or, I don't have an answer to that, which as a street epistemologist, that's the best answer you can get, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Needless to say, I enjoyed the exchange with everybody. And of course, we went a bit over time, further than expected, but I want to really, say thank you for indulging me in that. And of course, to our three panelists, plug yourselves. Where can people find you if they want to find you, if you want to be found, that is?
Well, I have my show Truth Wanted every Friday at 6. You can, and this week, actually, I have a very special guest. His name is Bryce Blankenagel, and he's going to be on there. And I'm hoping, and Bryce, you're going to have to help me with this, and your viewers are too. I want to get Mormons on. I want to get people who have those beliefs on, because you're the guy to talk to. And also, I just think I want to open up the show to as many people as possible. So definitely check that out. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at ObjectivelyDan. And yeah, there's the Facebook group for Truth Wanted. And we're also on YouTube and iTunes. So definitely check those out.
Awesome. Bryan, do you want to be found?
Sorry, I'm slow on the mute button. You can find me on Twitter at TaperDanman, or I bounce around occasionally between random podcasts of people I know, but I don't really have anything as far as content creator myself, so that's about it.
Fantastic. And Colleen, of course, where can people find you? And she may have stepped out. I'll go ahead and give Colleen the plug. You can find her at angelsonfire.org and Mormon Happy Hour podcast, and also Mormon Happy Hour. I believe it's at Mormon Happy Hour on Twitter. and to all of my panelists and to everybody who joined us during the live stream and to everyone who listens to us in the backlog, as also to Julie and Fred for joining us in the YouTube chat. Thank you all so much. It really was a pleasure, and I hope to see everybody next month. Take care, everybody.